pastors do, and he was visiting a female church member at her home one day, and he went up to the front door and he knocked, and he heard noise, he heard the radio on, but there was no answer to the door. So he went around to the side door thinking maybe that was the main way in, and so he knocked on that door, and he could see that the lights were on, but no one came to the door. So he decided that he would leave a little note, and so on the back of his business card, a verse came to his mind, and he thought he would leave that for her. And so on the back of his business card, he wrote Revelations 3, verse 20. So this is what he wrote. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with them, and they with me. And so he wrote that on the back of his card, and he tucked it into her door, and he left. The next Sunday, the female member of the church, she had come to church that Sunday, and they didn't have an opportunity to talk, but she slipped him a note into his hand. And so later, he opens the note, and he sees that there's a verse on there that she wrote back for him. And she wrote a verse from Genesis, chapter 3, verse 10. So this is what the note said. I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid. We never know what's going to happen when we knock on the door and we're going to visit. But you know, last night after I got home to the dinner, I looked over my calendar. I try and get my head ready for what's happening the next day and what my schedule looks like for the next week. And I looked at the calendar and I couldn't believe the year is like 1/12 over. I mean, did that happen like fast or what? I mean, I feel like we're still talking about New Year's, and yet we're all ready to flip the page of a calendar. We've been talking about resolutions. We've been talking about how we get to that certain point during the year and we take a look back. We look over our past life and we make some evaluations, some judgments, and we start to make decisions and set goals for ourselves in the new year. And I know a lot of you are still thinking about these resolutions because we all want to live our best year yet. We all want this year to be a little bit better than last year. There's an author by the name of Stephen Covey. I don't know if any of you have read some of his books. He writes a lot of business books, but they detail ways for people to be better. And in one book he called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he introduces a very profound principle. It's called begin with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind. So author Covey says that if you want December 31st to look any different, begin with that in mind and then work your way backwards. And that's to help you plan and schedule. It's a way for us to take the big goals and to break them down into bite-sized pieces. And I think that principle works very well, but I do wonder what helps us to define that goal. What helps us to discern what December 31st should look like for us? What helps us to decide, why are we all here? What is this life all about? Well, we've been looking through the scriptures over this whole month, and we've discovered that when we listen, when we pray, and when we trust in God, that life transformation and all of the resolutions that we have really don't come down to simple things like changing our eating habits or changing our jobs or changing how we spend our resources. We discovered that in meeting resolutions, in life transformation, in actually changing the direction of our lives, it's about a whole new foundation. It's about looking to something bigger than ourselves. It's about speaking to the one who created us. To discover what was the one who created us. What was his intention for us and for our lives. And so we discovered rather quickly, I think, is that the process of life transformation is more about how God works in us and then we work it out in the world. God works in us, and then we work it out. And so we talk about listening. We talk about listening to change the direction of our lives, to put us on that path that he calls the straightened path. We talked about prayer and how prayer changes the people and not the circumstances. And we talked about trusting in God because then God guides us. And I can't think of any other person in the Bible that we should be talking about today than one who is the greatest example of life transformation. And that's the Apostle Paul. Now, almost all of the letters written in our Greek Testament were authored by Paul when he was journeying during the days when Christianity was just being birthed here on the earth. And we're told that Paul was one of the most passionate Jesus haters ever lived. His sole purpose in life was to prosecute anyone who was following Jesus of Nazareth. And yet Paul, through a process of conversion and conviction, he changed the entire direction of his life. And it was through listening, it was through prayer, and it was through trusting in God that he was able to do that. Now, if you're like me and you tend to see these people that have this kind of bigger-than-life persona, you know, like the chiseled muscle model who's telling you that there's a great diet plan out there for you, or the real successful billionaire who's driving that real expensive sports car telling you how you should change your life. And you look at those people and you think, yeah, well, that's them. That's not me. You might be thinking, well, that's Paul. That's not me. I mean, Paul walked with Jesus. He touched Jesus. He heard Jesus speak. That's Paul, not me. I mean, maybe if I walked with Jesus, then, I'd be able to do that kind of thing. Maybe if I was blinded by my lack of faith, like Paul, then maybe I could be converted, or maybe then I could transform my life. Maybe if God spoke to me in an audible voice, like Paul, then I could be part of a life transformation process. But that's Paul, not me. And Paul sympathizes with us, because Paul experienced it. And Paul says over and over and over in this very same letter to the Corinthians, he says, if I can do it, so can you. If I can undergo life transformation so dramatic and so drastic to be able to continue to work in achieving the kingdom of God here on earth, if I can do it, then so can you. He reminds me of a quote that my mother used to say. My mother used to say, winners never quit. What was the rest of it? There you go. I don't know whether I keep going around. Winners never quit, quitters never win. And that's when we would turn to my mother and go, oh, Mom, you don't understand. Because it's not you that's going through it. And it may be true that sometimes winners never quit. But didn't you ever get to the point in your life when you really started to wonder, maybe it's time to quit? Did you ever get to that point where the excuses start to build up and all of a sudden you don't have 2, but you have 10 excuses as to why you shouldn't continue to keep pushing down on that path? I know when my mother used to say, hey, when the going gets tough, no, we used to say, that I'm out of here. I'm out of here. Because you have to admit, there's times when life gets tough and we say, I'm crawling back under the bed. I'm pulling the covers over my head and I'm staying here until things get better, right? Well, Paul writes about this very thing in his second letter to the Corinthian people. He lays out the plan. He tells us exactly how this is done. And he tells us that this is God's plan. And he has a great title for it. He calls it endurance. Endurance. He says if you want to live your best year yet, yes, it does take strength, and yes, it does take fortitude, and yes, it does take determination, but it also takes endurance. It takes endurance to run the race. It takes endurance to finish the course, he says. And you all know this because we see pictures of endurance all the time in our lives. We see those great examples of people with such grit and determination who've overcome great obstacles in their life and have achieved great celebrityness or got through lots of goals in their life. And these stories are very, very compelling. But I want you to think about Paul. Paul. The one who decided to change the course of his life and then was put into prison. The one who started to change the course of his life and then was flogged 5 times. He was beaten with a whip 5 times. He's the one who made this decision and then was beaten over and over. He was stoned. He was shipwrecked. He was put into prison without food. He went days without sleep on his journey. And Paul says to us, if I can do it, you can do it. It just takes endurance. In this letter to the people in Corinth, he points out some pictures. He creates ways for us to imagine what endurance looks like for us. And so this morning I'd like you to pull out your mental paintbrush, and I'd like you to start painting some images that Paul creates for us. Let's look back at the verses 8 and 9 again. Paul says endurance. Endurance when we're pressed. He says, and we are pressed in every way, but not crushed. I want you to think of next Sunday, football Sunday. I want you to think of the ball on the line. I want you to think of the quarterback waiting to receive the football. Just before the center snaps the ball, the quarterback looks up, and he's staring into the face of a whole line of 300-pound linemen that are just waiting to attack. Talk about feeling pressed and pressure. And when that ball gets snapped, what does the quarterback do? He stays in the pocket. He stays where he is protected. Even though he feels the pressure and the press coming on him, he stays where he knows he is pressed, but he is not crushed. Paul goes on to talk about endurance, and he paints another great image for us. He talks about endurance when we feel confused. We are perplexed, but not in despair. I want you to think of a woman sitting at a great big executive desk at work, and there are piles of paperwork all around her, and there are statistics and charts and graphs and all of these plans for the future, and she begins to feel overwhelmed. It begins to feel chaotic. How can she possibly muddle through all this and make a decision? And Paul says, we are not taken over by that. He says, we are perplexed, but not in despair. Then he goes on in the rest of verse 8 and verse 9, and he says, endurance is when we are chased. I'd like you to paint a whole other picture. Go out into the woods, into the deep forest, and imagine a wild game animal running through the forest, darting around trees and around bushes, either being chased by a fox or a hunter with a gun. And that wild game runs faster and faster until finally it breaks through the forest on the other side and loses the trail. Paul says we are persecuted. We are chased, but we are never abandoned. He then paints another great picture of endurance. He says we are struck down but not destroyed. Now I'd like you to think of a picture of a boxing ring. And the last final blow has been swung, and that boxer lays flat on the mat, and the referee is right next to him, pounding down the count before he's out. And just before the last digit is called, the boxer begins to push himself up off the mat. We've been struck down, but we are not destroyed. These are images that Paul plants in our head to understand what it means to have the endurance of God on our side. He says God has a plan for us. And if I can do it, so can you. So let's go back and look at verse 7. The very first section of this passage, he says, but we have this treasure. Did you know you have a treasure? Did you know that you're carrying a treasure from God? Paul says we have this treasure. We have God's deliberate plan. We have God's mighty power that is in us and displayed through us. And he gives us another mental image. He calls us earthen vessels or clay pots. You know the clay pots that you get at the grocery store or when you go to the garden center and you want to buy a pot for a flower and you pick out the cheapest, ugliest one? That's the clay pot. And Paul says that's us. That's us. We weren't created to be all by ourselves. We weren't created to be individuals. We were created to carry. Earthen vessels. We were created to carry something very powerful to help us endure life. And Paul says it's the mighty power of God. The mighty power of God is inside each and every one of us. And as earthen vessels, we've been given the honor of carrying that with us all the way throughout life. And I love the image of clay pots because, they're so different. Clay can be refined and honed down and sanded and sculpted and painted. The finest chinaware in the world is made from clay. It's also probably the most susceptible to being cracked. Probably where we get the term, some of us are crackpots. But there's lots of other pots too. There's an adobe clay that is made hard by baking in the sun. And that's what gives it its sturdiness. And it's also what makes it fragile because it's been baked in the hot, hot sun. That's probably why we get the term half-baked for some of us. We are all the gamuts of different kinds of vessels in this world. But we've all been given the same exact gift to carry. The mighty power of God Himself. That's the glory of what it means to be part of humanity. Men and women on this earth. Not thrown out to do whatever we want and to have all the power ourselves and be told, you can do this all by yourself. It actually goes against all of the teachings of being independent. It connects us with God. We're created to be the vessel that carries the power of God. We are created to carry the deity and the divinity of the one who created us. We are designed to work together in this world so that we have the endurance, so that we are not pressed, so that we are not crushed, so that we are not confused in chaos, so that we are not perplexed, so that we are not persecuted, and so that we are never struck down where we stay. Because we have the power in this world. We are clay pots, he says. Now we know that some people, when they begin to feel defeated, they also say they feel deflated. That they don't have the power to go on, that they lack the fortuitousness and the strength. And Paul says, no, that is not true. Several times in this letter to the Corinthians, Paul wrote this. He said, we do not ever give up. Ever. Ever. Christians don't give up. When it's fourth down and there's seconds to go in life, we do not give up, says Paul. Because we have the power of God inside of us. And we are the vessel which carries that out into the world. I think if Paul was alive today, he'd be right up there with Arthur Covey writing books about, the secrets to living your best year yet. Because he knows, he experienced the real pain, the real trouble, and the real disappointments that we all experience. And I feel like Paul could write a very short book and say, here it is, it's real simple, are you ready? Here's the secret to all of this. Here's the secret to endurance. And I want you all to do this with me this morning. Pick up one of your feet where you're sitting, pick it up in the air and place it down. Do it again. Up and down. That's it. That's it. Paul says, step. Step. That's the key to using the power that we've been given in the earthly vessels we are, is simply to step, simply to take the motion. He says all we need to do is step into the power of God. You've got it. Use it. Step into that power in the world. It's an extraordinary power. It's a power above all other things. He created everything. There's no power greater than that. We are fragile. We're easily cracked. We're easily broken, and sometimes we leak. But Paul says you're carrying the greatest gift ever, that can seal you and strengthen you and give you the endurance to get through whatever life is going to give you. You will never be held down. We don't do that. He says once we step into the power of God, pretty soon things are going to start opening up in our lives. We're going to be noticing something that usually doesn't happen to us. Usually when we're facing fear and disappointment and failure, our vision turns inward. We begin to think about ourselves an awful lot. We begin to think about how things are wrong in our life. We begin to think about how things are not going right for us. We begin to question, why isn't God serving me in this way? Why is God putting me through these things? Why is this happening to me? But Paul says when we step into the power of God, we become more aware of those around us. And then we begin to step again, and we step into other people's lives. We begin to step into other people's needs. And as we serve people and we care for people, we become more exposed to God's love in the world. And that gives us strength. Just spend the day serving someone else, and you will experience the strength of God working inside of you, so that you can get through whatever you're getting through. Because I know a lot of people have said to me, hey, what I've got is nothing compared to what they've got. We step into the power of God, we step into other people's needs, and then Paul says we need to step into a whole new perspective about life. We need to look at life the way God looks at life. Yeah, I've got some things that are down, but I've got some things that are up. I've got some things that aren't working great in my life, but I've got some wonderful blessings in my life. Yeah, there's some unknown moments that are coming my way, but I do know who's going to be with me during those. Yeah, I'm feeling down on that, but I know God's going to pick me up. And I'm not going to hear that final count. I know I feel like I'm being chased through the forest, but I know I'm going to make it through the other side and get away because God is pushing me along. We need to step into a whole new perspective in our lives. We need to step into the power of God. We need to step into other people's needs. And we need to step into having a new perspective on life. I've said this before, and I think I've probably said it for the past month, but if we really want to live our best year yet, it's not about changing our eating habits. It's not about changing our spending habits. It's not about changing our jobs or where we live. It's about opening ourselves up. It's about listening to God, praying to God. It's about trusting in God. And then it is about what? It is about step. Make the move and step. Now, I know some of you are kind of like me. You want to know that the step you're about to make is the correct one. I don't want to make the wrong step, Pastor, so I'm going to wait. I'm just going to sit right here on the sidelines until I'm absolutely sure that the step I'm about to make is the correct one. Paul says that's not how it works. That's not how it works. You're a vessel. You're holding the mighty power of God. You can't make a wrong step. God doesn't make wrong steps. He just wants you to step. And take that power out into the world and reflect what that power is doing in your life and inside of you. You can't go wrong if you step. Because you've got the power of God with you. You know, there's a rear admiral who's been credited with this saying. I want you to hear this, and I want you to listen very carefully, because he says, a ship in the port is safe. But that's not why ships were made. Ships were made to sail out into the great big ocean. Ships were made to go out and face the winds and the waves. And that's what you were made to do. You weren't made to sit safely behind. You were made to go ahead and step. And because you were made to do that, God has planted his power inside of you. It doesn't matter what the winds do. It doesn't matter what the waves do. You've got this. And Paul says, if I can do this, you can do this as well. Now, I know some of you are still a little hesitant about that step. So we're going to go to Psalms. We're going to go to the book of Psalms. We're going to chapter 37. Here are the words for you to rely on. Though we may stumble, we will not. We will not fall. For the Lord upholds us with his hand. The hand that created the universe is holding you. And we will not fall. We just need to step. We just need to step. And make this your best year yet.